This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a sociologist at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev and the author of the book Politics and Violence in Israel-Palestine, Democracy versus Military Rule. It was published by Routledge, and it offers a theoretical analysis of the relationship between these two terms, politics and violence, and how they came into play in a context of conflict, namely the Israeli-Palestinian. Professor Lev Grinberg, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, good morning.
So before we engage in a theoretical discussion, let me ask you this. Unlike other national conflicts that came to an end in the 1990s, South Africa and Northern Ireland are two examples that spring to mind. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict did not come to an end, despite a momentary ray of sunshine during the years of the Oslo peace process. Now, my question to you is why? Why did our conflict stand out? And I'm not interested in political commentary. Well, I am interested, but not right now. But rather in your insight as a sociologist, what can you offer? What can you say about the structural obstacles?
The structural obstacles differ from the South African case and from the North Ireland case. In the Israeli-Palestinian case, first of all, you don't have one common identity like South Africans. South Africa did indeed discriminate, obviously, the black population, but there were South Africans, all of them. And in this is exactly the point where democracy can work. It is when everyone recognizes that we belong to one community.
That there's a basis for national ethos?
For some national identity that recognize. So the struggle is to be equal. Mm-hmm. The Palestinian struggle is not to be equal, it's to be free. And this is a completely different struggle. The Palestinians don't want to be Israelis. And the Jews don't want to be part of one merged identity. Mm-hmm. This is a very, very clear difficulty. And obviously it's a little funny because in the 80s we couldn't imagine the solution of the black-white conflict in South Africa. It was very easy to imagine.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, you said that it's an obstacle, but in a way it's an advantage because there are many more examples in history where peoples who aspired to be independent and free got their independence and freedom. Independence and freedom are a lot more easily obtained than equality.
Yes.
They?
For this purpose, you need two basic elements that we didn't have. The first one is clear borders. If you have clear borders, you can have two separate states. But in Israel-Palestine, the borders are completely blurred. First and most clear, but obvious, is Jerusalem. You cannot divide Jerusalem. But also Israel penetrated constantly the West Bank, and you cannot even make a border in the West Bank. You can look at the wall. It's an absurd, complete absurd. Where you have borders, you can separate. This is the case of Gaza. In Gaza, the borders were completely clear. Then it was easy to withdraw, but they did it so bad. The withdrawal that is, in my opinion, a disaster in itself because they created a big ghetto or prison.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so no borders is the first one. You said there were two.
The second is power relations.
Okay.
The power relations must be in some balance in order to recognize the other. When one side is so powerful like Israel and so supported by the United States and the Europeans, So Israel is allowed to break the international law constantly for almost 50 years, and to do completely illegal things that they couldn't accept in any other place in the world. This is a crucial question, that even today you hear about the support of the U.S. That will give the promise $4 million every year for 10 years. So with such a support, why should Israel stop the violation of law of international law?
But you could say exactly the same thing about, again, if we go back to our favorite example, apartheid South Africa, that in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s enjoyed sweeping support from the Western world. Then it was still a bipolar world, but exactly for that reason, because they were staunchly anti-communist. Why does the Western support of Israel continue unabated, whereas it stopped for South Africa?
South Africa, you have the struggle of the Afro-Americans inside the United States for recognition of their rights, You have the fall of the the Soviet Union. So in this case, the change towards South Africa, international change of the attitude towards South Africa, is one of the clear factors.
But why didn't it happen in Israel's case? Exactly. I mean, the regional circumstances were, again, very favorable. The Soviet support for the Arab world collapsed. There was really a spring of the nations, in a sense, in the early 90s, and still.
The point is that Israel succeeded to convince almost all the world that we are ready to make peace, and the problem are the Palestinians. And this is what I called in my book, Imagine Peace. At the moment that Rabin and Arafat recognize each other, everyone imagine that we are in a peace process. And if you notice to the discourse, even today, they are talking about to resume the peace negotiations. What peace negotiations are you talking about? Israel is constantly expanding its domination of the Palestinians, strangling their economy, expanding the settlements, and they talk about peace.
You think there was really no goodwill on Israel's part ever from?
No. That's not my argument in the book. I don't say there was no goodwill, but Israel started the negotiations, and it was very clear and openly argued, because the Palestinians are very weak. And in the constellation after the first Gulf War, the Palestinians were completely dependent on the Arab countries, and the Arab countries were punishing them for their support of Saddam Hussein. And then this is the moment that we can make a deal with the Palestinians, where, as a matter of fact, we don't promise nothing. So Israel exploited the international situation in order to make a deal that, as a matter of fact, improved the domination of Palestinians by the collaboration of Arafat and his group.
Why did he do it then? And also...
Because he was weak.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And he says that also, we are so weak that we need to accept the terms. The terms are bad.
But they didn't accept the terms all the way through. I mean, the Palestinian intransigence is famous now. I mean, you can probably say that it was the result of Israeli propaganda, and a successful one. But the Palestinians were offered on several occasions terms to conclude the conflict indefinitely, and they rejected them. Now, had they been completely...
Now you're explaining exactly in the Israeli propaganda that succeeded.
No, but
to believe that Israel was ready to compromise, it's not true.
No, but
simply not true.
So what you're saying is that Israel never made the Palestinians an offer to end for a final settlement to the conflict?
There was one moment 2 weeks before the elections in 2001 that there was a retreat in Taba, and there was a kind of negotiation that most people that were there argued that they were very close to an agreement.
At that moment, I agree with you. But the thing is, that Israel made the Palestinians several offers that they couldn't accept because they didn't meet the minimum.
Yes.
But so my question to you is, if they're so weak, Why do they still have minimum?
They are. This is a very, very good question. I like it. They are weak in a certain moment, but in the long range, they are powerful, and they know that they need to continue the struggle, and in the end, they will succeed. This is something that you must understand. The Palestinian national movement was considered in the 30s the strongest national movement in all the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
By the British,
okay,
by the French. This, in 36 they did a 6-month general strike. And they were joking about the Egyptians and the Syrians. They cannot make a 2-day strike, and the Palestinians can do a strike for 6 months.
Right.
It means that it considered the most impressive and organized and well-disciplined national movement. But they have a very strong enemy, the British and the Jews.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that was the problem. And still, I think the Palestinians believe that in the future they will reach their goals, even much more than one small state in 22% of Palestine.
So the discrepancy in the power relations is not carved in stone. It is still temporary, at least in the minds of certainly the Palestinians, but also the Jews recognize that.
I don't know what the Jews recognize. I'm not sure that the Palestinians are completely aware of what I'm arguing. Arafat knew that he cannot compromise more than the 22% of the land of Palestine that he was demanding.
Right.
And I think he knew also he cannot compromise on Jerusalem. And he said that. And when he was offered to compromise on Jerusalem and on the temple and the holy places, he said, well, you can ask Mubarak or Hussein if they are ready, because it's not, Islam is not a Palestinian.
Mm-hmm.
So it was clear that he had some points of strength in his demands, and as a matter of fact, he promised when he signed this Oslo agreement in '93 that at the end he will get the Palestinian state.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, he continued mourning the death of or the assassination of Rabin much more than all the Jews, because he said he was the man that was ready to compromise. And this is related to the question if there was a goodwill in the. He believed that Rabin at the end will be able to come to the Israelis and say, "This is the deal that we need to accept in order to have peace." And he has the legitimacy to convince them. Barak didn't have any goodwill.
Right.
He was studying deeply how to cheat all the world. And he did it very, very successfully.
Well, and hence the intractability of the conflict. I want to go back to a thing that we discussed in the beginning of this conversation about the absence of borders and the fact that they are not clearly defined, and the different and how that's a structural obstacle towards the solution of.
I give the example of Algiers and France. Algiers and France have very clear borders. They're separated by the sea.
Yeah.
But if Algeria and France were a continuity, I'm not sure the French would stop expanding their settlements.
So you think it's a question of a border? I mean, the actual physical thing, rather than the model upon which it is constructed, namely colonialism, that in Algeria's case, it was classic colonialism, and in Israel's case, the occupation of the West Bank is a slightly more complicated situation.
The Zionist-Palestinian conflict is in it's not in this book, but it's in my posterior work, is a very peculiar case of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is usually used as a term to explain why the settlers displaced or ethnically cleansed and sometimes even the genocide of the native populations. The Zionist-Palestinian case is a case where the Zionists didn't have the power to completely displace the Palestinians, and not even for sure to kill them.
Not even in 48 during the Nakba?
Okay, in the specific, most of the time, the violence used against the Palestinians is minimal. The minimal violence necessary to displace them from this village and from other village one by one, and without a national clash. The only national clash was in 48, but you must know that in 48 the Palestinians were already defeated in advance from the beginning, because the defeat was in the 30s, when the real national revolt took place
against the British.
Against the British, and the British crushed them, and they dismantled completely the national movement, and also all the leaders were outside. Mm-hmm. So in 48, there was not a real war. It was a clash with some little organizations of villagers that tried to defend their villages. But the Israeli military was already prepared, and they have for sure the political constellation after the Holocaust, so the support of the United States and the Soviet Union all together.
Yeah.
And also the fact that the British withdrew from the territories. So this was a very peculiar situation. But we continue the small displacement of villagers until today. Mm-hmm. That is the point. It never ended. And this strategy, in this sense, constantly continues and recreates the conflict. Because there is no point where we ended and say, well, this is the state. Right. And this is exactly the point, that we don't have.
So that brings
borders.
me again to another question that I thought would be going back to, again, reversing the course of this conversation, but not. Do you think that if the Palestinians substitute their struggle for independence with a struggle for equality, they'll have more chances of winning?
No. Look at the Arabs inside Israel. They are fighting for democracy, simply to have equal citizenship, and they don't succeed.
But that's in the shadow of the conflict with the Palestinians in the territories, isn't it?
It's not the shadow. No. I don't think so. You know, the success of the Zionist project to create such a small empire, I would say, is that not as a part of a plan, but as a part of an historical development, the Palestinians are divided in 5 groups, big groups. Each of them have a completely different demand from Israel. Uh-huh. If you think about the refugees, obviously their demand is to return. If you think about the Gazan group, the Gazans, what they want is to end the blockade. Mm. If you think about the Palestinians in the West Bank, these are the people that want a state, yes, independence from Israel. If you think about the Jerusalemites the Palestinian Jerusalemites, they are not exactly demanding independence, because they might lose part of the rights they have in Israel. Mm-hmm.
And if you think about residents of the city, they are unlike Palestinians in the West Bank. They have less restrictions on mobility,
and they have social security, not simply issue. And if you think about the Palestinian citizens of Israel, their demand is for equal rights. So this divide of the Palestinians is the main problem, mm-hmm. and it's considered completely illegitimate to have a national council of all the Palestinians. If can you imagine what the government will do to the Palestinian citizens of Israel if they organize together with the refugees and the West Bankers and the Gazans to have a national representation in the negotiations, they will consider all of them terrorists and out of the law.
Yeah. Now let's get to the theoretical bit of your work.
You like theory.
I like theory, yes.
I know.
How do you theorize violence for this purposes, and what role does it really play in the progression of the conflict? I mean, the perpetuation of the conflict, as you say, it's still going on today.
Well, what I'm doing is something that is not completely new. Some people did it, like Hannah Arendt, is to make the distinction between power. She called it power and violence. I call it politics and violence. When you have a conflict between two groups, you have, as a matter of fact, two options. The stronger impose its will on the weaker, and this is violence. Or there is a kind of recognition of the rights of the weaker, and there is a kind of negotiation. Negotiation is always done through representation. Someone is going to speak in the name of the other. And in this case, you have politics. This is exactly the definition of politics. When you have the power to impose through violence, groups do it. And violence creates a circle of violence, because it's a cycle, because the reaction of the weaker is, if you use violence, I also will try to use violence.
Yeah.
But violence creates the fear of both groups and the hate, and then it closes the possibility of recognition, representation, and compromise. And this is exactly what I analyze in the case of the peace process. In order to open the political space of recognition and politics, the weak groups must demand recognition. And in order to do it, they organize and they demonstrate their presence. This is what the Palestinians did in the first Intifada, and the Israelis recognized that there is someone in the other side, that they deserve something, they have some rights, and then we need to negotiate with them. By the way, I emphasize that the first group that decided we need to negotiate with them was the military, because they couldn't repress. But what does it mean they couldn't repress? They didn't have the legitimacy to use all the power needed to repress.
But there's always violence in there, even in the struggle for a recognition. Don't you think that there are more chances to get recognition when you don't use violence? I mean, what are the pros and cons of a non-violent struggle vis-a-vis a violent one?
This is exactly the point that I try to explain. The question is, how do you use violence? If the weak side use violence in order to defeat the strong side, they will never succeed. They will create mainly fear and hate from the side of the stronger, and the legitimacy to use more and more violence. This is not what the Palestinians did in the first Intifada. Right. In the first Intifada, the struggle was to get recognition, and then they demarcated exactly where the borders of this Palestinian demand were, because everyone knew that the Intifada is in the West Bank and is in Gaza. Even in Jerusalem, we knew exactly what part of Jerusalem is in Intifada and where we can walk safely. So this demarcation of the borders created the possibility to recognize them and to imagine that we will have two-state solution.
However, in Gaza's case, in recent years, it's just the exact opposite. First of all, because the Hamas leadership use violence and for the purpose of defeating Israel. They say that. I mean, whether it's feasible or not is a secondary.
What they say is not the important point.
No, but it's exactly. So that is my question. Do you think that they believe in what they say, or do they do it in their own way to gain recognition as well?
No, this is kind of rhetoric. They know, and also, if you notice, since the end of the last cycle of violence 2 years ago, the military constantly say, make an agreement with the Hamas. We can make an agreement, and this agreement is exactly because we also cannot defeat them. And this is exactly the point of balance of power. But, when Israel has recognition of the legitimacy to keep the Palestinians in prison 11 years from all the world. So it continues because there is no pressure on Israel, except when the Hamas start shooting. But they shoot something that is completely unable to defeat the Israeli military. This is an absurd. The point was in the Second Intifada. What happened in the Second Intifada? In the Second Intifada, first of all, they blurred very rapidly the borders. In the penetration of the borders. It was not...
With suicide bombers in Tel Aviv.
No. This is a mistake. Suicide bombers in Tel Aviv, it was 5 months after the Intifada when there was so much support to repress them on legitimacy. The point of the fear of the Palestinians was when unintentionally they blurred the borders by the demonstrations of the citizens of Israel. The Palestinian citizens of Israel, they started to demonstrate, and there was violence. People were afraid to travel, even inside Tel Aviv and Haifa. It's not Jerusalem, because and for sure in Wadi Ara, the people were afraid to. And since then, many Israelis started to be afraid to come to the Palestinian villages, even to eat hummus.
Yes.
And this tension is not defining where the Palestinians are where we are. It's defining exactly that we are, all of us, in the same land. And this made things much more complicated. And the second point is that at a certain moment, after Sharon was elected, the Palestinians decided that they want to make some kind of balance of power by killing as much as Israelis they can. And they say that because the relation was 1 to 10. 10 Palestinians dead, when Israel dead. And they changed the relations to 1 to 3 or something like this by killing suicide bombers inside in Tel Aviv.
And that also made things more complicated because it increased the legitimacy of repression, of reprisal.
Exactly. And this is the cycle that it's very difficult to stop.
How can it be broken? By undermining the legitimacy or the international legitimacy of violence, in this case, more that goes to Israel more than to the Palestinians?
This is a debate about visions of the future. What do we need? 2 states, 1 state? I write very clearly in my book that the conclusion is that neither 1, neither 2. We need some kind of combination of 2 states and 1 state, taking the good ideas of both visions and merging them into one.
Which are freedom and independence on the one hand and equality on the other.
Which are, this is in the term of principles, but in the term of institutions, is that we need 2 separate states, but also one shared institution that runs everything that cannot be separated. A federation
of sorts.
I call it Israeli-Palestinian Union, and the model is much more like in Europe. You have states, but you have also Brazil.
Well, we've seen how well that worked.
No, this is a different issue. But these visions cannot implement it today. This is clear. Never matter what kind of vision do you have. In the present situation, what we need is a ceasefire and much more in non-belligerence agreement.
But what could instigate it if there's really no...
and in Arabic, it is a concept of hudna. We need an agreement that everyone will stop violence, and also civilians will be disarmed, and some kind of separation between the Israeli military and the civilian population by some international peacekeeping forces, ending the blockade. It means we need to, I don't enter into all the details, but we need an agreement now, and this agreement can only be imposed from above.
Right.
Yeah, and it can be imposed only when some not representative of the Palestinians, but the supporters of the Palestinians, like Turkey or some Arab countries, and some representatives of supporters of Israel, like United States or Europe, come together and bring the kit to make some.
One day, inshallah, Professor Lev Grinberg. But I'm afraid we'll have to leave it here. You are a sociologist at Ben-Gurion University and the author of several books, including Politics and Violence in Israel-Palestine, Democracy versus Military Rule. Thank you very much for coming in today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And also big thanks to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
סוף שבוע בכפר, את היית נהדרת, בשמלה פרחונית ופרפר, היית מתבדרת.